Well, it's Tuesday.
It is.
And we got something interesting to show you, as always. Mm-hmm. This is sort of the collector's attic, but as you can see, we're not in the collector's attic. We're in the editing room, and we're in a part of the editing room that you haven't seen before because it's the filing cabinets.
Oh, my. Yeah, there's a lot of them, too.
There's a lot. Well, and yes, there are some things in there like income taxes and that sort of thing. But the number one thing that's in there is my stash of paperwork from railroads. And
railroads, because I have a stash of paperwork too, but we're not going there.
We're not going there. But I've never considered myself a collector of such things, and yet over the years I've ended up being a collector of such things. Timetables and photographs and building plans and receipts from amusement parks. And it's all really fascinating stuff. But in spite of the fact that I've never really considered myself a collector of that stuff, and yet here we go. I've got thousands of photographs.
That's about to change.
That's about to change? Oh. There's something in the works, I guess.
I guess so. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, that's what that bell was all about.
Well, I do have a birthday coming.
Yes.
Okay. Anyway, what we want to show you this week is in this drawer right here. And it's this guidebook, this brochure, the official guidebook for the Chicago Railroad Fair of 1948.
48?
Yes, 35 cents. Now, I did not collect this exactly. I mean, I've got it in my collection now. But my grandfather bought this at the fair.
Oh, cool.
Because he went there in 1948. He was from Chicago, and he had migrated west, as people tend to do.
Right.
But he was always going back to visit friends and family. And he'd take the train, and he'd go back to Chicago, because everything, all trains go to Chicago. They do now. They didn't back then. And anyway, and that's part of what this fair was about, was celebrating 100 years of trains in Chicago.
Back then
in 1948, because the first train to arrive in Chicago was 1848.
Oh.
And that's why 100 years. But it was quite the event that they put on, and we want to go through the guidebook here and show you exactly what was in here and what kind of an amazing event this was. So check this out. Well, while we were at the museum in Sacramento, they have some really neat displays, and some of it's paper.
Oh, my goodness.
Magazines and whatever. A track. This is just really neat. But in this one display case was a poster for the Chicago Rail Fair, 1948. And I was looking at that going, and so when we got back to Salt Lake, I thought, we got to dig out the guide, the official guidebook that Gramps bought back in 1948. The whole purpose for the Chicago Railroad Fair was to celebrate, as I said, 100 years of railroading history. And that sort of stripped my gears, because railroads have been around for more than 100 years in 1948. But Chicago was only about, 10, 15 years old in 1848. And where it seemed like a logical place to build a city right there on the Chicago River at Lake Michigan, the downside was it was the middle of a swamp.
Oh, dear.
And so they were building their roads out of wood planks. And that's not a very efficient way to move stuff around. So someone suggested building a railroad. So they did. In 1848, they put in a 10-mile railroad to Galena. The Galena and Chicago Union Railroad. And they bought this locomotive, which manages to survive and therefore was at the fair. They bought it used, I think, from the B&O, but I'm not sure. But they bought it used, and in the fall of 1848, they hauled a load of wheat to a ship and loaded it on a ship and sent it to the East Coast, proving in concept that this would work. And in no time at all, there were railroads extending out from Chicago like spokes on a wheel. Just amazing development. And immediately, Chicago became the railroad hub of America. And it still is. So anyway, in 1948, they decided to have this great big huge railroad fair and celebrate that. Now these are really cool. These are postcards from the fair, and they've got Big Boy 4004 on them because it was on display for a period of time at least at the fair. We got these cards from Frank.
Yeah.
You remember?
Who can forget him and his models?
Oh my heck, and his bird poop on his model. We digress.
I love it.
But he was very kind, and he found these postcards, and he knew we were into the Chicago Railroad Fair, and so he gave us these neat postcards from the fair. And so I keep them tucked into the guidebook here. But the guidebook explains the history of railroading in Chicago, and then it goes through scene by scene and breaks out the Wheels A-Rolling pageant. So the Railroad Fair site was built right on the shore of Lake Michigan. It was more than a mile long.
Wow, they did things big there.
They did. It was a big fair. It was a really big deal. And it wasn't that far from the old World's Fair site, White City, which is now the Chicago Museum of Science and Industry, where we've had some good times.
Fun place to visit.
And in fact, a lot of the displays from the Railroad Fair ended up over there.
Oh, nice.
And so we saw them, and so that's kind of like we were here in a weird sort of way. But they had to lay all of this track along the shore of Lake Michigan because the trains needed to be able to move up and down the fair site. And then at some point they started bringing in the historic locomotives and unloading them. Isn't that neat?
That's fun.
And then they had other equipment too. This is, of course, a fire wagon.
Yes.
Because they just had so much room and so many interesting displays. They kicked the fair off with this parade on State Street. Look at that.
That's wonderful.
And these are not the locomotives, these are floats. They built floats to look like the locomotives that were in the pageant, and then the real locomotives were down at the fairground.
Oh, that's so cool.
Now, the streamline train on the backtrack is the pioneer's effort, and we saw that. That's one of the things that's at the Museum of Science and Industry. And I always wondered why it was called the Pioneer. Well, that original 1848 locomotive was the Pioneer. So I guess it was named for that. I'm not sure. Anyway, here on the first page, as the pageant got started, they brought out some of the most historic wagons and trains. And here are some of the Baltimore and Ohio, the B&O. And we've seen these engines at the B&O Museum.
Yes.
Some are original, some are recreations for the rail fair, like this recreation of the Tom Thumb, their very first engine. The next page in the guidebook goes on to the next few scenes of the big pageant, and the locomotives are getting more and more modern here. And this is where they actually talked about the history of Chicago, because now we're caught up to 1848, and they brought out the Pioneer, which again was on display here at the fair, and this is when it made its big appearance in the pageant. But then all of the other historic locomotives, this is another B&O, but of course a much later locomotive. This is more like an 1860 locomotive. And that brought them to their reenactment of the driving of the Golden Spike, which, of course, we just had the 150th anniversary, and we've been doing that all summer long. But they did that back then, and they had the Virginia and Truckee Genoa, which is there at the Sacramento Railroad Museum on display. But it was dressed up as the Jupiter for the pageant. Now, I'm not sure just what locomotive they dressed up as the 119, but it really doesn't look anything like the... And who came up with that paint job, for crying out loud?
Oh, my goodness.
Whoever came up with that, you're fired. That's ridiculous. Anyway, that's their version of the 119 for the reenactment of the driving of the Golden Spike. Also, they included the Chinese workers as part of their reenactment, where at the real event, they were not allowed anywhere near it, unfortunately.
That's so unfair.
Oh, it was ridiculous. Anyway, we digress. So the next section of the show was post-Golden Spike, going into the more modern era of railroading.
Look, they've included automobiles. Chicago's not that far from Detroit, which is the production center of many automobiles.
Yes, I mean, it was a transportation fair, and they've got cable cars and horse cars. This is also where they brought in the streamline trains, one of which was the Burlington Pioneer Zephyr, but Union Pacific also had their M10,000 streamliner here.
It was so cool that we got to see this at the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago.
That was neat. You know, Union Pacific had their M10,000 streamliner here as well. That's always been one of my favorite trains. On these pages, we can see a map of the entire fair site, like I say, over a mile along the lakeshore there. And the map breaks out all these little individual pavilions so you can see what was here. Just a lot of really neat displays. And they had a switching yard there to hold the complete trains. Now this is really neat because it was a mile long. They had a railroad to connect the whole thing for people to ride on, the Deadwood Central.
Oh my, what a name.
They said it was a recreation of an Old West railroad with a mile of track running right through the middle of the fair site, and they used old Rio Grande equipment, which actually at that time wasn't that old.
No.
But they brought in a whole bunch of Denver and Rio Grande Western equipment, I think 6 coaches and a locomotive, and that's what was the Deadwood Central. And here we can see the locomotive being taken to the fair. It's kind of a crappy picture, I know, but I zoomed way in because the detail's really, really small. But if you look very closely behind these F.A. locomotives, which are on their way to the fair, is the Deadwood Central locomotive loaded on a flat car.
Wow.
And it's all dressed up to look earlier than it really is, and here's a better picture of it.
Wow,
So
look at
it's
that.
actually Rio Grande's 268 C16 locomotive, and they painted it all up in what people have called the Bumblebee paint scheme. The Denver and Rio Grande yellow and black with 2 stripes. And here it is at Chicago operating the Deadwood Central. So anybody that says the Denver and Rio Grande Western never made it to Chicago is a liar. There it is.
There it is.
There it is right there. A Denver and Rio Grande Western C16 number 268 on the shore of Lake Michigan. I'm not sure what became of the coaches, but I'm wondering if there are some of the coaches that ended up at Knott's Berry Farm.
I wonder.
Now at that same time, another C16, this is a Grant C16, number 223, was given a very similar dress-up, the same fake diamond stack and fake headlight, and it was given to Salt Lake City to be displayed in Liberty Park. And I don't know if that's coincidence, it's probably just coincidence, but it all happens at about the same time. That locomotive is now being restored at the Utah State Railroad Museum in Ogden. Now, right after the fair, 268 was used in the movie Denver and Rio Grande Western, along with several other C-16s, still in its Bumblebee paint job. And after that, it was returned to active duty in Colorado, and it is now on display in Gunnison, Colorado, still wearing the Bumblebee paint job.
Oh, that's cool.
It's really neat. But a lot of people have no idea that it was painted that way for the Chicago Rail Fair. They think it was painted that way for the movie Denver and Rio Grande Western. Now you can see in this picture that the diamond stack and fake headlight were removed, but they were still there during the shooting of the movie. There were a lot of other really neat exhibits. They completely recreated Chicago's very first train station, and that's where they were displaying the Pioneer along with a coach, and a recreation of Colorado's Central City Depot, which is one of the depots on the Deadwood Central. So that was pretty neat. The depot at the other end of the line was from Deadwood, South Dakota, hence Deadwood Central.
Oh,
They even had a full-size working reproduction of Old Faithful Geyser.
oh really?
They went all out. The Rio Grande also had a display showing off their greatest new idea, a movie theater in a passenger car.
Well, there you go.
So long before they were showing movies on airplanes, they were planning to show them on trains. It just never quite came to fruition. And the Pullman and Bud companies were there showing off their greatest and latest new passenger car ideas, including cars for the California Zephyr.
Wow.
And of course, it just wouldn't be a railroad fair if they didn't have a model railroad.
Exactly.
So I understand they had just one really amazing model railroad. And there again, I wonder if it had any connection with the big model railroad that ended up at the Museum of Science and Industry.
I think so.
It could be, but I don't know. If anybody knows, jump into the comment area and let us know about that. Because a lot of these displays did stay right there on the shores of Lake Michigan. This is 999, the New York Central 999 that had the world's record, first locomotive to break 100 miles an hour. This is also the locomotive that they recreated up at the amusement park Lagoon.
Oh, really?
For their first train ride, and that's on display in Pioneer Village up there. And here's the display from the rail fair. They had it with a coach on display, and it's still there in the Museum of Science and Industry.
You know, I have the souvenir of this locomotive. It was created in wax by a wax mold.
Yeah, there was a rage in the 60s, those wax injector souvenir things. And this one, we saw this one at the Illinois Railway Museum.
We did.
And it's prominently displayed up there, Rogers locomotive, and just a really pretty and historic engine. As I recall, it has some connection, some history with the famous locomotive engineer Casey Jones.
Oh, nice.
Ooh, and here we have the General.
Oh, I love that one.
They brought the General in from Atlanta for the rail fair, and then, of course, they took it back to Atlanta, where it is still on display.
You know, I bought another model to make that one.
I know, this is your next project. But I've always loved the General. What a beautiful engine. Oh, and here's two very famous characters that showed up at the rail fair incognito. That's Walt Disney and Ward Kimball.
Well, there you go.
And they were actually on their way to Detroit to check out Greenfield Village to get ideas for Disneyland.
Oh, fun.
But they stopped at the rail fair and stayed very much under the radar, or they'd have been mobbed by autograph hunters and so on. But these are photographs from their trip east to get ideas for Disneyland.
We have that show, Walking with Walt. That's a fun one.
Yeah, and it's all about their trip to get ideas for Disneyland. There's a lot of other story to it. It's the whole birth and development of Disneyland, but it starts with this trip east where they headed off and stopped here at the rail fair on their way to Detroit.
Wow.
Now, the rail fair actually lasted 2 complete years. They ran it in 48 and 49, and this is the official guidebook from 1949. A little bit different because the displays had been changed up and some of the equipment was different. And this was the music from the pageant, and you can get the sheet music, and that's available on eBay, and I've been sort of tempted to grab one, but I don't know. But anyway, there it is. And the Santa Fe had built an Indian village for their display, and this is the souvenir guidebook for the Santa Fe's Indian village. But there was all kinds of interesting collectibles, stamps. The U.S. Post Office put out a whole series of commemorative stamps, one series for each railroad which was there at the fair. So there's a whole bunch of different commemorative stamps, all from the rail fair. We don't collect stamps, but it is sort of tempting, I guess.
Yeah, I actually did for a while.
Well, there you go. Maybe we can find some of those stamps.
We'll have to.
Well, that was neat.
Wow.
What a railroad. I wish we could have gone to that.
Exactly. It'd be nice to time travel.
Oh boy, there'd be so many things to do. When did time machine be a thing?
Yes.
But we kind of have a time machine. That's why we collect all this stuff.
Exactly.
It's the closest
heirlooms.
thing. It's the closest thing to having a time machine. Well, if you haven't been over to the channel, do pop over to the channel. And if you're not a subscriber, the blue button is about to appear. You ready? Zoink! Blue button right there. Well, we're not sure how you found this on the internet. We hope you didn't find it boring. And we will see you here on Sunday with the Sunday show.
Yeah.
We'll see you there.
See ya.
Bye-bye.
Bye.